going to be more and more folks still trickling in throughout. But super excited to have you all today for our webinar around developing a strategic vision for your volunteer program, right? And so I think a lot of us are often focused on the day-to-day and the management of volunteers, but we're going to look to see if we can take things just one step up, right? And think about strategically, what you might also want to start considering. And so, like I mentioned, my name is Gung, like Gung Ho, that's easier. And I'm the CEO and co-founder here at Civic Champs. Went to school at Michigan State, go green. Also got my MBA from Harvard Business School. Previously did most of my career in corporate, but have always loved volunteering with different organizations like United Way or Habitat. And so, we launched Civic Champs in 2019, right before the pandemic, with the goal of supporting nonprofits like yourself. And so this is sort of my passion, if you will.
13
and
through
super
17.
excited to have Beth join us today. So Beth is the president of VQ Volunteer Strategies and is truly an expert. She's actually speaking right now at the Points of Light conference around volunteer engagement. And so, we're super thrilled to have her share sort of her knowledge and insights with us. Beth, do you want us to say a little quick self-introduction as well?
Sure. First, thank you to Gung and Civic Champs for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and really, really happy to be with each of you tuning in virtually today. As Gung said, I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies, which is an organization that consults throughout the US and Canada with organizations of all sizes to help them achieve smarter impact by leveraging volunteer talent at all levels of the organization. And so it's something I, as like Gung, am very passionate about, wake up every day excited to help people like you better harness the power of volunteers to achieve your missions to make the world a better place. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're lucky to have you. So thank you for being here. So in terms of the content, right? So this is what we'll talk about today. So first, we're going to introduce the concept of strategic volunteer engagement, right? So what is it? What does it mean? How is it different, perhaps, than just when we think about volunteer management? Then we'll talk about some of the challenges. Why do organizations not do this today? What's sort of keeping folks back? We'll dig into some of the benefits, of course, right? And then think about, how do you get started, right? What are sort of the next steps, and that you can take away from today? And then stay until the end, because we have a number of really neat freebies and giveaways at the end that we'd love to share with you. So stay till the end for that information. So without further ado, we'll sort of kick it off. And so Beth, I'll actually, toss it over to you, right? When we talk about strategic volunteer engagement, what does that mean, and how is that different? And what from your sort of expert perspective, what would you share with everyone?
First, I will give you all a chance on the call to envision what strategic engagement could look like at your organization by asking you all to indulge me with a short little thought exercise. Take a moment. You don't have to close your eyes if you don't want to, but you're welcome to. Just take a deep breath and imagine what it would be like if your organization, whether it's an animal welfare organization, a food insecurity organization, whatever it is, had all the resources it needs to serve more clients, deliver more programs, strengthen your staff in terms of skills and security, broadcast your message to your potential constituents and supporters more widely, and even increase financial stability. Maybe a hard world to imagine all of that right now, but if you could imagine what that would feel like, know that when we engage volunteers strategically, we have the potential to tap into all the resources to make that vision a reality. It's a pretty great vision. The question is, how do you get there? One of the ways to get there is to consider volunteers not as program participants, but instead as partners, a strategic partner in helping your organization fulfill mission, which we'll get to in just a moment. But how do we define strategic volunteer engagement? We define it as a framework that recognizes volunteers as a vital asset of any organization, an asset that's critical to your ability to advance its mission and accomplish its goals. So they are a vital asset, not just as board members and as direct service providers, but everything in between, vertically in your org chart and horizontally. That's what strategic volunteer engagement is. It's a framework to achieve your mission.
Awesome, thank you. And I guess for me, right, and we talked about this very briefly as we were preparing, but you know, there is a difference, right, between thinking about volunteer management as a program and volunteer engagement strategically. And so maybe for our audience, you know, how would you differentiate that?
So it's not uncommon, and it frankly isn't wrong to talk about volunteers as a program or volunteer management as a program. Volunteers in frameworks, organizations where it's talked about as a program, they can help deliver programs, they can help extend your reach. They certainly serve in governance. But they're not necessarily, usually when volunteers are considered a program, they are managed off in one little branch of the org chart and not necessarily seen as a foundational asset for all levels of the organization. Another thing, when language is really powerful, and when we talk about volunteer management as a program, we define volunteers as program participants. When volunteers are viewed as program participants, then they are pitted against other program participants in competition for resources at the organization. So when, say, a global pandemic and a subsequent enormous significant recession happens, like that which happened 3 years ago, and you're looking to cut resources and assets, of course, volunteers viewed as program participants become, again, in competition with other program participants and are often the first thing, and were often the first thing to get cut. In contrast, when we view volunteer engagement as a strategy, as a resource to tap into, like financial resources, like staff, human capital, and other capital resources, then volunteers become an answer and a solution to help address whatever problems the organization faces. So when an organization views volunteer engagement as a strategy, volunteers and volunteer engagement are part of the strategic plan. The volunteer leader has a voice, directly or indirectly, at the leadership table. There is a vision statement for volunteer engagement that describes how volunteers can drive success against the mission, how engaging volunteers fits into your mission fulfillment. So all of those are ways that we differentiate strategic volunteer engagement from volunteer management, in that it's not the responsibility of just one person, it's the responsibility of everyone in the organization. And when you do that, you gain a lot of benefits. And so, and they look differently. So when organizations engage strategically in volunteer engagement, they excel in the management and engagement of volunteers. They, as I said, engage volunteers all over the organization. As a result, they have greater capacity to deliver programs to reach more audiences, and therefore can more effectively address current needs as well as emerging needs that might pop up because they're more nimble. Research through the Service Enterprise Initiative, and research originally by TCC Group back about 10, 15 years ago, show that organizations that engage volunteers, do so strategically, do it well, can operate at almost half the median budget of that of their peers who don't engage volunteers. Doesn't mean that if you do it well, you get to cut your budget in half, but it means you get to increase your capacity to match that of peers that have a bigger budget. And this is not just hearsay, this is research-based data. Organizations that engage volunteers strategically are better positioned to grow, to adapt, and sustain their mission. And we certainly saw that. I certainly saw that play out throughout the country since 2020. So lots of benefits and a whole different look to the organization when they do it that way. Yeah.
Again, yeah, I think that's so true, right? And we also saw this, as we launched right before the pandemic, and so the folks who had a bit more of a strategic view and could articulate that right to their staff, to their volunteers, and to funders, certainly ended up doing well, and sort of surviving and thriving through the pandemic even. So that's awesome. And so obviously lots of benefits, lots of reasons to do this, but I think what we've noticed here at Civic Champs is oftentimes volunteer strategy is not necessarily at the top of the list for executive directors or CEOs. It's not the thing that they spend their time thinking about, and so much so that perhaps they don't spend hardly any time, right? And so I think this is really interesting because when you ask nonprofit leaders, right, 2 and 3, folks say that they do believe that volunteers increase the quality of services and extend the reach. So it is important to them. But on the flip side, when we look at funders, right, and this is we'll share the report that this data is from the sort of Initiative of Strategic Volunteer Engagement. But when you ask funders, only 1 in 3 have actually received funding requests for volunteer engagement, right? And so what that to me says is, while we say it's important, we're not asking for the resources or help to make this actually a strategic priority, right? And so I'd love to hear from you, Beth, right? Why is it that nonprofit organizations are not doing this today?
So there's a lot of history to overcome, of course, and history around language, history around the evolution of nonprofits. No matter when your nonprofit was formed, chances are your organization was started by volunteers. And at that point, volunteers likely were doing everything with the organization. And yet, as organizations grow and mature in the typical life cycle of organizational development, there's an effort to professionalize by hiring staff. And what happens as we professionalize, volunteers become more limited in the ways that they're engaged traditionally as board members and perhaps in direct service roles. And that certainly, that little microcosm represents the history of nonprofits in the United States in the 20th century. And the volunteer engagement structures that were developed were designed throughout the 20th century by and for a generation that liked to engage over the long term, to earn their 20-year pins, to be affiliated. Today, that model doesn't necessarily resonate, and our ability to tap into people for short-term projects, like these are all things many organizations are still learning to let go of the ways that they always did things or the way they saw things being done in other organizations. So history is a big factor. Another big factor is the pervasive myth that volunteers are free. Engaging volunteers takes resources. Miranda even made know we need a position, and we need to invest human capital in managing these relationships with volunteers. It takes time, and when we create this myth or support this myth that engaging volunteers is free, it can inadvertently create fear and discomfort and resistance among staff members that if they engage volunteers, they will be replaced by volunteers. So two big things that get in the way, and they both come down to culture, right? Two big things that get in the way are overcoming history of a limited view of how volunteers could engage, and supporting that myth, continuing to talk about volunteers as a free resource, which could in fact undermine people's openness to engaging volunteers for fear that they will eventually be replaced by a more cost-effective model, as opposed to having CEOs that set the tone and say, everyone here is responsible for engaging volunteers, and your role as a staff member, a paid staff member, if you have paid staff members, is to engage volunteers to build capacity beyond what you alone can achieve, and engage volunteers to free up our staff to do the work for which they're uniquely qualified. So it's history and it's language that often gets in our way.
What about org structure? And so, I sort of borrowed this from your website, actually, Beth, right, from VQ Volunteer Strategies. And so, one of the things we've seen is, as we are serving nonprofits, that volunteer managers and volunteer coordinators sit in many different places, right? Sometimes they're under programs, sometimes they're under HR, sometimes they're under, development. And so love to, understand from you, are there pros and cons to those decisions, and where should they sit, if any, right place?
So there's definitely pros and cons, and people ask me this all the time. And my first answer is always, there's no one right way. I personally believe there may be a couple wrong ways, but there's no one right way to structure where to place volunteer engagement in your org chart. What I've seen be most pivotal in helping organizations really maximize the volunteer resource is ensuring that wherever a leader of volunteers, volunteer engagement professional, a VEP, is placed, is that they have a voice at the leadership table, whether that's a C-suite, if you're big enough to have that, directly reporting to a CEO, if you can do that, or have a really strong advocate. So when you have a volunteer engagement professional under development, the advantages are it's seen as part of resource development, and that's great. It's, we're increasing resources, both financial and otherwise, by having it under fund development or advancement. On the other hand, the drawback is that volunteers may only be tapped for events and for fundraising. And that's a very limited view. When it's under programs, lots of great, a lot of times volunteer engagement is under programs because they're helping to deliver programs. They don't necessarily see volunteers. The risk is they don't see volunteers as capacity building. They may not tap marketing volunteers, experts, to do pro bono work in the marketing division or in other areas. There's a big movement to have volunteer engagement professionals sit within human resources divisions of talent, under the director of talent and culture or the human capital department. That's wonderful because it's looking at volunteers as part of the team, paid and unpaid. They're both team members of a nonprofit. Personally, I think that, of course, given my work, I think that having a director of engagement as part of that C-suite makes a lot of sense because they are a resource. They can tap into a resource that supports the whole organization.
Awesome. Yeah, hopefully everyone can sort of move in that direction, right, and elevate the important role, right, that a volunteer manager or volunteer engagement professional is able to play. And I think, one of the things that I think about too is obviously there's lots of important things, right, that we should do. And so I always try to think about, what's sort of the impetus for change today? Why now? Why should I spend time on this versus something else, right? And so I think there's really three main reasons, right? And so the first is that volunteers themselves have higher expectations. And this is driven, I think, really by two things, right? So if you think about COVID-19, right, and sort of the pandemic, as people ramp down their programs, lots of volunteers, were no longer active, and so now we're trying to recruit them back. And so you can see this in the private sector too, where people don't want to do necessarily the same things that they did before, right? And so this is when we're thinking about hiring and the challenges there. That's also true for volunteers, right? People are more, I think that on the upside, people want to do things that have more impact, the things that they feel they're making a positive difference in the world, right? So that's great. But on the other hand, they're expecting more from the roles themselves, right? And so if you still are asking people to come in and do filing for you, but not explaining the importance of that, right? That can be tough to keep recruiting for those volunteers. So I think that's one. The second piece on the volunteer side is technology, right? And so if you think about all the things that we use in the world, whether that's Amazon or Uber or anything else, right? Everything is super easy and almost magical, right? You tap a button and you get, whatever it is on your wish list to your house the next day. It's kind of, it's kind of magical, right? And so our expectations on experience are heightened as consumers. And so I think that's also important to remember, right? Like we, as a sector also need to up our game, right? And that's sort of why, Civic Champs is here to some degree. I think the second piece, of course, is we always hear that nonprofits, right, we need to do more with less. I think that's, while that's in some ways too bad, I think that the pressure continues, right, in that regard, where we need to continue to drive more impact with ever more efficiently, if you will, and in part because, kind of leading to point 3, is that funders look for that, right? And so funders are looking for their sort of, in many ways, their best investment, right? They say, hey, I have so many dollars. I want to make the greatest impact I can in our communities. Who and how should I sort of allocate this, this tranche of funding? And so they're going to look for organizations that are more effective and efficient. And part of that is funders value actually effective volunteer programs. And so I'll show just a couple sort of quick stats here around that, right? But 70% of funders connect volunteerism to a stronger civil society. So they, at a macro level, really believe this is important, right? And then 55% of funders believe volunteer engagement improves an organization's capacity to make connections with people within their community. And so if you can articulate that vision, that strategy, right, to a funder that says, here's how we think about volunteerism, and here is how it really makes our, sort of helps the mission move forward. That I think could be really powerful, right, in your next grant application. So I don't know, Beth, is that something you see, anything you would want to add here?
Yeah, thank you. And this research, which is very recent, it just came out in February, it really, it was very enlightening, even to those of us who, and I do this as a volunteer, help support and move that research through. It was great to see that so many funders believe in the potential of volunteer engagement. The really sobering, and I'll admit somewhat surprising part of the research was that so few CEOs were asking for funding. And so what does that mean? It means that we have work to do at the leadership level of nonprofits. So if you are a leader, embrace your role as CEO, as chief engagement officer, not just chief executive officer, but see how you can really move the conversation forward around how volunteers drive impact and directly benefit your organization. Yes, some funders want to hear about hours and the dollar value that those hours represent, but how else are volunteers really driving impact for your constituents, for the people who benefit from your programs, for the environment you serve? Diversifying how you talk about and reveal the impacts is a major opportunity for CEOs. And if you're not a CEO on this call, then you have to put on your mantle of leadership as a leader of volunteers to make that case to your CEO. And that means creative and talking about the impact. Looking at this data point, 55% of funders believe that volunteer engagement improves your ability to make connections with people and with the community. Let's get that other 45% believing that. And also, in what ways? How can you demonstrate how your organization achieves that to the 55% current believers? And that's about, again, not seeing volunteers as program participants, but as partners in achieving your mission.
And hopefully, this next section, as we talk about the benefits of strategic volunteer engagement, right, can really help both our folks who are on this webinar who are CEOs and EDs, but also if you need to articulate this to your CEO ED, this might be something that you can bring to them, right? And so I think we have sort of a set of 5 different benefits. And so we'll sort of walk through each of them, and we'll share the slides here at the end with everyone. And so no need to necessarily take copious notes. We'll have a recording that we'll share as well, so if you can reference back to here. But the first benefit here is more adaptable, sustainable, and scalable organizations. I think, Beth, you already talked about this earlier, right? But if you have strategic volunteer engagement, the fact that you have volunteers who are supporting you across the entire organization, right, sort of allows you to be more nimble, to have that sustainability built in. But yeah, anything else you would add here, Beth?
Yeah, I mean, I'll ask I'll pose a question for each of these 5 after you introduce each, that our participants can think about how to apply these data points to their storytelling, right? So how can you tell the story? What stories do you have to tell about how volunteers helped you sustain impact and sustain your services in recent years, despite all of the myriad disruptions? Are you a food pantry that suddenly had 4-fold increase in demand for your services, and volunteers were what enabled you to increase delivery of food, even if you had fewer volunteers? Or were you a museum or arts organization that had to shut down, but volunteers, maybe even a smaller number, helped provide virtual tours to keep people connected to the arts while they were at home? So that's my question for 1, I'll say.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then so the second thing we think strategic volunteer engagement helps you with is obviously with grants and budget dollars, right? And so a lot of grants ask for this, right? Explicitly, perhaps even that, hey, can you match my grant with either dollars or sort of volunteering? And so the ability for you to track and to, but also articulate that, say, hey, we're not just matching, perhaps direct labor volunteers, but maybe also, skilled volunteers. Maybe it's, our board members, and here's how they're doing, and here's how it drives whatever impact that the funder is looking for, right? And Beth, yes, I'll sort of turn it over to you.
Building on that, how funders want to know that you're stewarding their resources effectively, financial and otherwise. So how are you stewarding the volunteer resource to free staff up to do work for which they're uniquely qualified, to raise additional funds, to just extend the resources? And really enlightened funders are asking grant applicants to articulate how volunteers will be engaged even in program grant applications to deliver programs. So that's exciting to see. How can you demonstrate that, even if not asked, but to your prospective and current funders?
And then increasing impact and awareness, right? And so I think we the only reason, right, we we want to do strategic volunteer engagement is at the end of the day to further our mission and impact, right? And make sure that this is important because it helps us do the work to serve our communities. And so, we talked about this already in terms of all the different ways that this would help increase your impact. But also, I think if you adopt a more strategic viewpoint, it will also increase the awareness, right? Because you're also now thinking about this messaging, right? That you're and how you speak and talk about your volunteers, and that means that when you're talking to your volunteers or explaining sort of the impact that they have, they're also able to better articulate that when they're out in the community, right? And so driving more awareness of your mission and what you're doing by simply going through this exercise, or at least that's how I think about it, right? And so Beth, love to get your thoughts again.
Again, building on that, Gung, it's about telling the story of how you are transforming current volunteers into ambassadors for your organization and its mission. Are you equipping them to be talent scouts to engage additional volunteers in their community? Are you equipping them to share the mission and the impact of their involvement to inspire others to give time or money or both? And so those are stories you want to be telling, because and not just to funders, but to prospective volunteers, to community members, everybody.
And I think this next one, right, really ties into that, which is stronger community ties. And so obviously, right, if you're able to engage people, right, not just volunteers across a broader spectrum of different activities, ways of engaging with you, right, you're going to build those stronger community ties as well. And so that's certainly a benefit. And we have some other webinars that we've done around how to engage your corporate partners, right, and in terms of getting access to those volunteer matching grants, right? And part of that is, once you take this sort of strategic view on what what can volunteers bring to the table for your organization, you can start to be thoughtful or more thoughtful about some of those other opportunities that also exist in your community as well, right? In terms of engaging some of the different entities or organizations in your communities, in a more thoughtful way. So, Beth, anything else you'd add there?
Briefly, I'll just add that when we view volunteer engagement as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion work as well, we can see this as a strategy that brings voices into the organization, helps us be more culturally competent. When we engage from within communities being served, we increase our impact, frankly. And so, in fact, one of the examples that I've seen in recent years, when we think about those org charts from a few slides back, is the volunteer engagement professional now falling under the director of DEI at organizations, because community engagement is very much a part of equity. So how are you already doing that, regardless of where volunteer engagement sits in your org chart? And how can you tell that story as well? But that's definitely a benefit.
Yeah, super, super important. And then last but not least, we talked about this in a couple different flavors, right? Improved fundraising, whether that's with funders, but I think also with individual donors, right? All the examples that I love, Beth, you sort of raised is around storytelling, right? And really, when you think about your asks with donors, so much is that about storytelling and articulating your vision and what you're doing and how you're impacting the community and how you're getting people engaged, right? And so I think this is obviously a huge benefit. But yeah, Beth, I'd love to get your perspective on what else you might want to add here.
Yeah, I mean, research consistently has shown for decades that people give their time where they give their money, and they give their money where they give their time. So yes, it's okay to be asking to be inviting volunteers to also become financial donors. It's also okay to invite donors to become volunteers. It's a missed opportunity if you don't.
Yeah.
And even if they're not giving, volunteers can play a major role in fundraising. So how are you doing that? If you're not placed in, if volunteer engagement is not in the development department, how are you coordinating to maximize this potential benefit?
Right. Yeah. I think the stat that we often have seen, right, volunteers are twice as likely to give, right, than non-volunteers. And the number one reason that they don't, when you ask, is that they were never asked. And so I think that's so interesting and so true, not just for volunteering, but generally for so many other things. Too, right? And so one of the things, sort of building on this, right, is obviously with Civic Champs, we're a technology platform. And so our goal is really to amplify or augment your, organization's ability to do all of this, right? And so just real quickly, I thought I would share how Civic Champs, or, and you can, sort of replace us with other volunteer management software, right? But, one example of how you might leverage technology to accomplish some of the goals that we've seen here, right? And so what you're seeing here, right, is basically our mobile app screen. And so people can engage with Civic Champs with mobile, right? They can engage with kiosks. And so on the screen, in two taps that you just saw there, someone was checking into an event, right? And so this is how we're starting to track, in this case, Emily's volunteer hours, right? And it's, trying to keep it super simple, right? But then in addition to that, when someone checks out with Civic Champs, right, for example, we actually collect feedback and sentiment. And so now you're sort of starting to move beyond dollars, oh, sorry, not beyond dollars, but beyond just hours, right? And you're able to understand, how happy are your volunteers, right? What kind of reflections, and you can start to, look through those reflections, see if there's any trends that folks are mentioning, right? And then even more powerful, right, so we were just talking about fundraising, is in this example, if your volunteer was feeling inspired, they said, hey, I had a fantastic experience, right? In that moment, when they're still thinking about you, you can ask them for a small dollar donation through something like Civic Champs, right? And we try to make it as easy as possible. We call it micro donations, right? Tying it again, articulating that story, tying it back to the action that they've just taken, right? And so making it so that it doesn't come out of nowhere, but rather saying, hey, you can further your support, or further your, the activity that you were just participating in through this, additional gift, right? And then of course, what we need is also the ability to report all of this information, right? So we talked a lot about funders and grants, and so the ability to pull together real quickly how many volunteers you've had, how many hours they've done, right? But also, again, when you look at the sentiment, you can start thinking about, hey, if I want to sort of strategically engage my volunteers and I want to look for advocates, right? Well, and I know some people had great experiences. Well, those are the perfect folks for you to reach out to say, hey, would you mind helping me recruit other volunteers, right? Would you mind being an advocate and telling our story in different ways, or maybe leaving a testimonial, right? And you can quickly see, right, just the different reflections people might have. And so, and just as important, right, if someone had a poor experience, right, you want to make sure that you're able to re-engage them as quickly as possible. We all know that people that are unhappy usually don't keep it to themselves, right? They're going to share it with the world. And so you want to make sure you give them an outlet and address those issues before it impacts you, right, in sort of other ways. So just want to show that real quickly for folks in terms of how you might leverage technology, right? And so the last two things we have, right, is just how do you get started, and then we'll share some freebies. And so getting started, I think, is it's pretty straightforward, right? There's sort of 4 steps that we have here. So the first is just starting the conversation, right? So as you take away, from this webinar, talk to other folks in your organization to say, hey, I was on this webinar, it was really great, and I think we can be more strategic about how we think about our volunteers, right? And whether that's with your ED, other colleagues, and perhaps even with your volunteers, right? Just engage them directly and say, hey, how would you, are there, I was on this great webinar and I was inspired and I wanted to ask you, right, James or Julie, right, how, are there other ways we can be engaging you, right, with in terms of as a volunteer? And you see here what they say. And then the other, sort of step 2 is assessing where you are today, right? And you might want to actually flip step 2 and 1, depending on what you think would be most effective, right? And so if you want to go to your executive director or CEO and say, hey, I've already done a little bit of homework, if you will, right? You might actually want to start with this stage potentially, right? And so we'll share with you here actually, we actually have a template here that Beth and BQ Volunteer Strategies has shared graciously with everyone. Just a really simple way to assess, where are you today? Do you do these activities, right? And I would encourage everyone to leverage this tool. It gives you some, at a minimum, thought starters for things that you can do, right? If you're like, oh no, I never do this, right? And it only takes about 10 minutes to go through that assessment. And so there's a link here, and we'll sort of share that in chat here as well in terms of how you get access to that. But yeah, real quickly, Beth, anything you'd add on the assessment?
Thanks. I think it has proven to be a really helpful tool. There's 8 pages covering each of the 8 phases of arc of a volunteer's engagement, from creating a role through recruitment, screening, eventually up to your whole organization-wide commitment. And it's a great tool to drive conversation. We especially love when organizations, and they find it really valuable when it's not just the volunteer engagement professional who takes it, but gives it to a group of people, and then they compare notes and find out, oh, folks in development didn't even know that we had a process for screening volunteers, or the folks in program didn't realize that we have an org-wide recognition process. So it's a great conversation starter, and then it can also provide insights to help you determine where you want to focus first in moving the needle and making changes, because you don't have to do it all. But so hope you find it useful.
Yeah. And I think that leads perfectly to sort of step 3, which is pretty straightforward, right? It's as you do this assessment, you start talking about it and sort of make a plan for that to happen. Of course, I would be remiss not to say, obviously it can be helpful, right, to have some support for processes like this. And so, Beth and her team are fantastic as consultants in terms of really helping you think through what that actionable plan could be. And so encourage you to consider, leveraging Beth and her team for this as well. And then I think, last but not least, obviously just implementation of the plan, right? All the planning and thinking is great, but none of it matters if you don't do anything about it. But what I would say, from the perspective of an entrepreneur, especially, is that taking action, any action, is fantastic, right? And so make sure you give yourself a bit of grace when it comes to like, oh, we came up with this great strategic plan and we're going to do these 5-pronged implementation, but we've only managed to do 2 of the 5. Right? I think, instead of, lamenting or being, hard on yourself about missing out on the 3 other things, right? Really celebrating the wins that you already have, right? And so, I know folks can be pretty hard on themselves, but, small incremental steps, right? If you continue to do them, will really build up over time. And so that's what I would encourage people to just keep in mind, right? Is, don't give up just because you didn't get to, 100% right away, but rather say, hey, we got to 5%. Well, next week we're going to get to 7, and then we're going to get to 9, and you'll be surprised after a year, right, how far you'll get. That's anything you would want to add here?
No, I think it's just all recognize that you're leading a change. And as Gung said, celebrate the small wins along the way, because you are working to help your organization overcome a lot of history and forge a new path. So embrace that role as a change leader, and yep, celebrate those small wins.
Perfect. Well, I think this actually brings us pretty close to the end of our webinar. And so just, I'd like to, make sure we sort of recap, what were our learning takeaways. And so hopefully you found, this slide to be true, but, we covered during this webinar, what is strategic volunteer engagement? How is that different from maybe program? Two, what are the benefits, right? We talked about some of the potential roadblocks and sort of the history and the org structure and some of the challenges that you might face. And then last but not least, right, hopefully you got a sense of how you might get started along with a pretty cool little assessment tool that you can leverage, right? And so as promised, though, we have a number of freebies that we want to share with you. But in case you want to, keep in touch with myself or Beth, here's sort of our contact information. So there's one slide for me. Again, we're going to share the slides and the recording with you all, so you have that. But you can certainly, feel free to reach out and connect with me. And then this is Beth's information, and so feel free to connect with her as well. And then, again, here's a link to the VQ Volunteer Strategies assessment. And so, these are the 8 areas that you would sort of be able to assess, starting from, sort of end to end, that journey for volunteers. And then last but not least, right, is for folks that come to our webinar, for this one at least, we're going to offer a 25% off discount. This offer expires in a month. So, if you're interested in Civic Champs or learning more, feel free to book a meeting with me using that link that's listed there. We'll put it in the chat as well. But, this will expire in mid-July. So, feel free to take advantage of that. And then upcoming webinars. So we are doing a webinar every week at the same time. And so they're all going to be at 10 a.m. Pacific or 1 p.m. Eastern on Thursdays. And so coming up on the 22nd, we have creative tech solutions to source free goods for your nonprofits. Everyone loves free goods. And so this is going to be co-presented by Liquid Donate, one of our partners. But you won't want to miss that, because you'll learn how you can actually get lots of freebies with very little work, really. Then on the 29th, we talked about grants today, but Instrumental, another partner of ours, is going to talk about how you can use volunteer metrics for grant success. And then on the 6th of next month, we're going to work with CauseVox and talk about how, turning your volunteers into super supporters, right? So, best practices for, donor and volunteer engagement. And so if you're interested in those, we'll have sort of in our follow-up email links to register for those webinars. With that, we'll open it up to some Q&A if folks are interested. And yeah, if you want to raise your hand or just type it in chat, happy to answer any questions. I suppose as we're waiting for that, I should also just say a big thank you to Beth for joining us. It was so nice to have you on today and getting your sort of expert advice and is so valuable. I think everyone really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks again for everyone having me. Maybe if there's anyone typing, I'll toss in one little takeaway, since you all aren't at the Points of Light, one of the largest gatherings of volunteering and service. I'll share a key takeaway I heard at this morning's plenary, a little inspiration from Nikki Clifton, who's the leader for the UPS Foundation for their engagement in corporate philanthropy. She said they're doing 3 things differently. I think we can all learn about this as they think about engagement in this reality in which we're all working. One is they're listening differently. So I'd say listen differently to your volunteers, to your constituents, to really hear how we can connect them to true impact. They focus on better, not more. A big advocate for, yes, hours and dollar value have their place, but how can we engage and deploy people for more impact, or for better impact, not just for more hours? And finally, communicate our why. And to me, that's about, why should people engage with you? Why should they engage now? And what's the difference that they're going to make? So that was what inspired me this morning in Chicago, and maybe they'll give you some inspiration as well.
Yeah, I was just trying to think, reflecting on my own why, why. I think that's so powerful, right? Because we're all mission-driven folks here on this call. Otherwise, we wouldn't be, in this sector. And so, I think it's so powerful to think about your why, so that just keep yourself motivated and excited about the work. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. We'll send out the slides and the recording again for everyone, so you have that. And also thank you for everything you all do and for your communities. That probably isn't said nearly enough, but nonprofits are the safety net, right, for our communities. And without nonprofits, right, so many folks would sort of fall through those cracks, and we're here to catch them. So thank you for doing that. All right, well, happy Thursday, everyone, and enjoy Father's Day / Juneteenth weekend.